we're running out of clean drinking water and there's like no good TikTok hook for that. Like you don't think about aquifers and groundwater that much, but like on top of the normal map of the world, there is an underground map as well that shows like where all of this water is. And today on my series, actually what's happening, we're going to talk about countries that are fighting over water. And today I want to talk about like the aquifer and groundwater system globally, what's happening with that, and like what we're trying to do to make sure we have enough water to like, you know, live and stuff. A lot of those aquifers are gigantic and they cross country borders. Like the UN says that like about 65% of countries rely on a groundwater aquifer or groundwater system that spans multiple borders, which means that you have to have like different agreements in place in order for the people of your country to be able to access that groundwater, right? But the problem is, for many years, we really didn't like really measure how much water was in those aquifers because there wasn't really like a problem. And also, as we've been measuring that over the last few years with different technology, it looks like we're like sort of running out. I started learning about this a couple years ago because the New York Times did this like really big story where they compiled a bunch of national aquifer data from around the US and tried to like map out how those levels were. And about half of all drinking water comes from aquifers, about half of it comes from like surface water, like rivers and dams and stuff like that. And so it is important to follow. In the US, about 90% of our water that we use for things like irrigation and stuff comes from aquifers as well. So a lot of our food supply depends on it here. In the US, more than half of our aquifers are being like pumped out faster than they can be replenished, which will ultimately run out, right? I thought this was like a really interesting graphic because you can kind of see that like as you pump out more water than you should from those aquifers, what will end up happening potentially is that the land begins to settle, which means that the gap where the water's being held in these like underground wells begins to shrink, which means you actually can't replenish it then with more water either. And that's important because actually when you look at Arizona, that is one great place where like in Tucson, they've done a lot of work to restrict water usage and also like kind of move some of the Colorado River flow into their aquifer system, which has helped Tucson like really raise their levels. But if you don't do that fast enough, you ultimately may end up in a place where you don't have the space underground to even hold the aquifers in the safe way that we're used to as humans being able to get like drinking water. So in 2024, the UC Santa Barbara scientists published a bunch of data that was in partnership with these journalists and scientists in NASA and stuff to say that actually almost 3/4 of aquifers are actually declining, and they're declining far faster than you would expect from natural means. And so it's a global problem. This summer, France published this map that shows like how quickly their groundwater is beginning to drop, and the UK also like just declared a drought across a lot of the United Kingdom because they've had a super hot summer and they're running out a little bit of water. And I'm not a scientist, and so I mostly try to follow these things in terms of global news events. And I thought this was a crazy article in Foreign Policy this last month from a deputy minister in Gambia who was talking about how hydroterrorism is beginning to be on the rise. Our current treaty systems don't really address that well. And basically, like, water is being weaponized. It's both a resource that can be used to starve people out, like has been happening particularly in Gaza recently, and the horrific events that are happening there. And it's also happening a lot in West Africa. And I'll get into this in my geopolitical episode this month, but like in the Sahel region, there is a huge kind of growing movement of what I would call a terrorist group. And they are weaponizing water to try to get more people to join them because they are the ones controlling this precious resource there. So Gambia has done a good job of like kind of staying away from all of that, like sort of terrorist group joining, but they're going to end up in a worse and worse position as their water supply worsens, in part because of both salinization from rising ocean waters and also because of like dropping aquifer rates. And this has real world impacts on just kind of like general, like all humans, right? So Cape Town a few years ago had what they were calling an imminent day zero event where they were just going to run out of water, and they were able to get around that essentially by telling the public like, hey, you got to like super restrict your usage, by trying to get corporations to also pull less water, and they got sort of lucky because they got like some huge amounts of rainfall that helped replenish some of their supplies. Mexico City also recently has had a day zero event that may be incoming. They've gotten a lot of rain recently that sort of helped them mitigate against that too, but we're going to see more and more places run into this problem, and I don't know that we are like giving it the attention that it deserves. And quick update on last month too. So if you follow this series, you know that we come back to these topics every month or two, depending on how busy I am. Last month we talked about two big things that were happening in Southeast Asia that I wanted to come back to. One is in India, they have a big dam that basically they have been weaponizing against Pakistan since May, since they had this big like conflict in May. And this month they have opened up diplomatic relations with Pakistan and basically said like, hey, we noticed that like there may be some really bad flooding. You might want to like get your emergency personnel ready and maybe evacuate some people from an area, which is good for diplomacy, but it's bad because the way that they used it, the channel that they used to communicate that was not the water treaty that's been in place since the 60s that they suspended. Instead, they used like foreign policy channels from a humanitarian angle. And I think that's really, it's good and bad, right? So that's one thing that I wanted to come back to. And the other thing is somebody mentioned in my comments about a huge dam that's being built in China, and they just broke ground on that this week. And it is the biggest hydroelectric dam in the world. And that dam will allow China to do to India what India is doing to Pakistan, because it's flowing that direction west. And I think that that could have huge geopolitical consequences too, but it'll take many years for them to be able to build it.